Hi, beautiful humans. Today we are going over chapter 21 of A People's History of the United States, written by Howard Zinn. This chapter is titled Carter, Reagan, Bush, the Bipartisan Consensus. I've only gotten through half of this chapter, so I will record part 1 now, and then hopefully I finish reading part 2 of this chapter and can record it by the end of the week, but we will see. So far, what I'm gathering here is that Zinn is trying to basically make the point that regardless of whether you have a Democratic president or a Republican president, the main priorities are the same, which is money. We already knew that, though. We talk a lot about, actually, the other day I just saw a video about somebody saying that Jimmy Carter was their favorite president, all that stuff. Jimmy Carter has a great reputation of being for the people and all that stuff. But let's be for real. That man was for the Vietnam War. You know, he did do certain things that were helpful. They were more progressive, but there were also decisions that he was making that went against the needs of the people. And so it's also very interesting to notice how strategic it was that he was the president, because people needed to have some kind of hope that things were getting better and that the presidents were actually listening. And so he was a perfect president to come in and to say, yeah, you know, civil rights and human rights and, you know, these like welfare programs and just more money going to people. But in reality, that was nothing in comparison to the benefits that the wealthy were getting from him. And then we're going to talk about Reagan, and this is the thing. There's so much I want to say. But basically, regardless of whether you have a Republican or a Democratic president, the priorities of government remain the same. However, there are very, very stark differences between a government that is run by unapologetic conservatives who really don't give a fuck about the people, and then a more progressive president, a Democratic president who technically doesn't give a fuck about the people because they still make decisions that go against progress, like the genuine progress of people. But they do a little bit more for the people than a conservative government would. And so even now, as people are talking about like, oh, whether Trump or Biden wins, like it's all the same shit. In many ways, that's true. And in many ways, it's not, because it can get worse. But it doesn't mean that it's great when you have a progressive president. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like both options are shit. Just one of them is like in hell. I don't know. There's an argument to be made right now that things are in hell, but also Project 2025. That is hell. Let me not get too carried away here. Let's just dive into chapter 21. After the disastrous war in Vietnam came the scandals of Watergate. There was a deepening economic insecurity for much of the population, along with environmental deterioration and a growing culture of violence and family disarray. Clearly, such fundamental problems could not be solved without bold changes in the social and economic structure, but no major party candidates proposed such changes. In recognition of this, perhaps only vaguely conscious of this, voters stayed away from the polls in large numbers, or voted without enthusiasm. More and more they declared, if only by non-participation, their alienation from the political system, which I feel like is very much so relevant to this year and this moment and the conversations that a lot of people are having about the elections in November. In 1960, 63% of those eligible to vote voted in the presidential election. By 1976, this figure had dropped to only 53%. In a CBS News and New York Times survey, over half of the respondents said that public officials did not care about the people like them. A typical response came from a plumber. The President of the United States isn't going to solve our problems. The problems are too big. There was a troubling incongruity within society. Electoral politics dominated the press and television screens, and the doings of presidents, members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, and other officials were treated as if they constituted the history of the country. Yet, there was something artificial in all of this, something pumped up, a straining to persuade a skeptical public that this was all, that they must rest their hopes for the future in Washington politicians, none of whom were inspiring, because it seemed that behind the bombast, the rhetoric, the promises, their major concern was their own political power. The distance between politics and the people was reflected clearly in the culture. A citizenry disillusioned with politics and with what pretended to be intelligent discussions of politics turned its attention to entertainment, to gossip, to 10,000 schemes for self-help. Those at its margins became violent, finding scapegoats within one's group or against other races, immigrants, demonized foreigners, welfare mothers, minor criminals. Indeed, all across the country, there was part of the public unmentioned in the media, ignored by political leaders, energetically active in thousands of local groups around the country. These organized groups were campaigning for environmental protection, or women's rights, or decent health care, or housing for the homeless, or against military spending. This activism was unlike that of the 60s, when the surge of protests against race segregation and war became an overwhelming national force. It struggled uphill against callous political leaders trying to reach fellow Americans, most of whom saw little hope in either the politics of voting or the politics of protest. The presidency of Jimmy Carter, covering the years 1977 to 1980, seemed an attempt by one part of the establishment that represented in the Democratic Party to recapture a disillusioned citizenry. But Carter, despite a few gestures toward Black people and the poor, despite talks of human rights abroad, remained within the historic political boundaries of the American system, protecting corporate wealth and power, maintaining a huge military machine that drained the national wealth, allying the United States with right-wing tyrannies abroad. Carter seemed to be the choice of that international group of powerful influence wielders, the Trilateral Commission. Go back to the previous chapter to learn about who started the Trilateral Commission and what their intentions were. Two founding members of the commission, according to the Far Eastern Economic Review, David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, thought Carter was the right person for the presidential election of 1976, given that the Watergate-plagued Republican Party was a sure loser. Carter's job as president, from the point of view of the establishment, was to halt the rushing disappointment of the American people with the government, with the economic system, with disastrous military adventures abroad. In his campaign, he tried to speak with the disillusioned and angry. His strongest appeal was to Blacks, whose rebellion in the late 60s was the most frightening challenge to authority since the labor and unemployed upsurges in the 30s. His appeal was populist, that is, he appealed to various elements of American society who saw themselves beleaguered by the powerful and wealthy, although he himself was a millionaire peanut grower, which I didn't know, because I always heard that he was, a farmer and all that stuff, and obviously he was, but I didn't know he was like a wealthy farmer. But am I surprised? No, I'm not surprised. Although he was a millionaire peanut grower, he presented himself as an ordinary American farmer. Although he had been a supporter of the Vietnam War until its end, he presented himself as a sympathizer with those who had been against the war, and he appealed to many of the young rebels of the 60s by his promise to cut the military budget. In a much publicized speech to lawyers, Carter spoke out against the use of the law to protect the rich. He appointed a Black woman, Patricia Harris, as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and a Black civil rights veteran, Andrew Young, as ambassador to the United Nations. He gave the job of heading the Domestic Youth Service Corps to a young former anti-war activist, Sam Brown. His most crucial appointments, however, were in keeping with the Trilateral Commission report of Harvard political science Samuel Huntington, which said that whatever groups voted for a president once elected, what counts then is his ability to mobilize support from the leaders of key institutions. Brzezinski, a traditional Cold War intellectual, became Carter's national security advisor. His Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown, had, during the Vietnam War, according to the Pentagon Papers, envisaged the elimination of virtually all of the constraints under which the bombing then operated. His Secretary of Energy, James Schlesinger, as Secretary of Defense under Nixon, was described by a member of the Washington Press Corps as showing an almost missionary drive in seeking to reverse a downward trend in the defense budget. A financial writer wrote not long after Carter's election, "So far, Mr. Carter's actions, commentary, and particularly his cabinet appointments have been highly reassuring to the business community." Veteran Washington correspondent Tom Wicker wrote, "The available evidence is that Mr. Carter so far is opting for Wall Street's confidence." Under Carter, the United States continued to support all over the world regimes that engage in imprisonment of dissenters, torture, and mass murder. In the Philippines, in Iran, in Nicaragua, and in Indonesia, where the inhabitants of East Timor were being annihilated in a campaign bordering on genocide. Carter had presented himself as a friend of the movement against the war, but when Nixon mimed Haiphong, Harbor, or Haiphong, I'm not sure, harbor, and resumed bombing of North Vietnam in the spring of 1973, Carter urged that we give President Nixon our backing and support whether or not we agree with specific decisions. Once elected, Carter declined to give aid to Vietnam for reconstruction, despite the fact that the land had been devastated by American bombing. Asked about this at a press conference, Carter replied that there was no special obligation on the United States to do this because the destruction was mutual. Considering that the United States had crossed half the globe with an enormous fleet of bombers and 2 million soldiers, and after 8 years left a tiny nation with over 1 million dead and its land in ruins, this was an astounding statement. One establishment intention, perhaps, was that future generations see the war not as it appeared in the Defense Department's own Pentagon Papers, as a ruthless attack on civilian populations for strategic military and economic interests, but as an unfortunate error. Noam Chomsky, one of the leading anti-war intellectuals during the Vietnam period, looked in mid-1978 at how the history of the war was being presented in the major media and wrote that they were destroying the historical record and supplanting it with a more comfortable story, reducing lessons of the war to the socially neutral categories of error, ignorance, and cost, which, as we see what's happening right now in Palestine, how many times has the Israeli government done shit, killed people, and said, oh, it was an error? It is strategy. It is language being used to lessen the severity of the real things that they are doing. This is on purpose. This is on purpose, which is why I also want to read books about media literacy and that kind of thing, because we have to be able to pick apart and notice the strategic manipulation of language and stories, what they leave out, what they leave in, how they present it. The renegotiation of the Panama Canal Treaty with the tiny Central American Republic of Panama was an example. The canal saved American companies $1.5 billion a year in delivery costs, and the United States collected $150 million a year in tolls, out of which it paid the Panama government $2.3 million, while maintaining 14 military bases in the area. Back in 1903, the United States had engineered a revolution against Colombia, set up the new tiny Republic of Panama in Central America, and dictated a treaty giving the United States military bases control of the Panama Canal and sovereignty in perpetuity. The Carter administration in 1977, responding to anti-American protests in Panama, decided to renegotiate the treaty. The New York Times was candid about the canal. We stole it and removed the incriminating evidence from our history books. Whatever Carter's sophistication in foreign policy, certain fundamentals operated in the late 60s and in the 70s. American corporations were active all over the world on a scale never seen before. There were, by the early 70s, about 300 U.S. corporations, including the 7 largest banks, which earned 40% of their net profits outside of the United States. The relationship of these global corporations with the poorer countries had been an exploiting one. It was clear from U.S. Department of Commerce figures, whereas U.S. corporations in Europe between 1950 and 1965 invested $8.1 billion and made $5.5 billion in profits. Listen to this. In Latin America, they invested $3.8 billion and made $11.2 billion in profits. And in Africa, they invested $5.2 billion and made $14.3 billion in profit. It was the classical imperial situation where the places with natural wealth became victims of more powerful nations whose power came from the seized wealth. American corporations depended on the poorer countries for 100% of their diamonds, coffee, platinum, mercury, natural rubber, and cobalt. They got 98% of their manganese from abroad, 90% of their chrome and aluminum, and 20 to 40% of certain imports. Platinum, mercury, cobalt, chrome, manganese came from Africa. And yet the United States cultivated a reputation for being generous with its riches. Indeed, it had frequently given aid to disaster victims. This aid, however, often depended on political loyalty. In early 1975, the press carried a dispatch from Washington. Secretary of State Henry A. Kissinger has formally initiated a policy of selecting for cutbacks in American aid those nations that have sided against the U.S. in votes in the United Nations. In some cases, the cutbacks involve food and humanitarian relief. Most aid was openly military, and by 1975, the United States exported $9.5 billion in arms. The Carter administration promised to end the sale of arms to repressive regimes, but when it took office, the bulk of the sales continued. We love it when they lie. In 1979, as Carter weakened proposed benefits for the poor, and Congress strongly turned them down, a Black woman, Marian Wright Edelman, director of the Children's Defense Fund in Washington, pointed to some facts. 1 of every 7 American children, 10 million altogether, had no known regular source of primary health care. 1 of every 3 children under 17, 18 million altogether, had never seen a dentist. In 1979, while the poor were taking cuts, the salary of the chairman of Exxon Oil was being raised to $830,000 a year, and that of the chairman of Mobil Oil to over $1 million a year. Carter made some efforts to hold onto social programs, but this was undermined by his very large military budgets, which he had said in his campaigns that he was going to cut. Presumably, this was to guard against the Soviet Union, but when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, Carter could take only symbolic action, like reinstituting the draft or calling for a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. A report by the Carter administration to Congress in 1977 was blunt, saying that a number of countries with deplorable records of human rights observance are also countries where we have important security and foreign policy interests. Thus, Carter asked Congress in the spring of 1980 for $5.7 million in credits for the military junta fighting off a peasant rebellion in El Salvador. In the Philippines, after the 1978 National Assembly elections, President Ferdinand Marcos imprisoned 10 of the 21 losing opposition candidates. Many prisoners were tortured, many civilians were killed. Still, Carter urged Congress to give Marcos $300 million in military aid for the next 5 years. Jimmy Carter faced Ronald Reagan in the election of 1980. That fact and the economic distress felt by many were largely responsible for Carter's defeat. Reagan's victory, followed 8 years later by the election of George Bush, meant that another part of the establishment, lacking even the faint liberalism of the Carter presidency, would now be in charge. The policies would be more crass, cutting benefits to poor people, lowering taxes for the wealthy, increasing the military budget, filling the federal court system with conservative judges, actively working to destroy revolutionary movements in the Caribbean. The dozen years of the Reagan-Bush presidency transformed the federal judiciary, never more than moderately liberal, into a predominantly conservative institution. By the fall of 1991, Reagan and Bush had filled more than half of the 837 federal judgeships and appointed enough right-wing justices to transform the Supreme Court. In the 70s, with liberal justices William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall in the lead, the court had declared death penalties unconstitutional, has supported the right of women to choose abortions, and had interpreted the civil rights laws permitting special attention to blacks and women to make up for past discrimination, affirmative action. William Rehnquist, first named to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon, was made Chief Justice by Ronald Reagan. In the Reagan-Bush years, the Rehnquist court made a series of decisions that weakened Roe v. Wade, brought back the death penalty, reduced the rights of detainees against police powers, prevented doctors and federally supported family planning clinics from giving women information on abortions, and said that poor people could be forced to pay for public education. Justices William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall were the last of the court's liberals. Old and ill, though reluctant to give up the fight, they retired. The final act to create a conservative Supreme Court was President Bush's nomination to replace Marshall. He chose a black conservative, Clarence Thomas, despite dramatic testimony from a former colleague, a young black law professor named Anita Hill, that Thomas had sexually harassed her. Thomas was approved by the Senate, and now the Supreme Court moved even more decisively to the right. One of the first acts of the Reagan administration was to dismiss from their jobs en masse striking air traffic controllers. It was a warning to future strikers and a sign of the weakness of the labor movement, which in the 30s and 40s had been a powerful force. Corporate America became the greatest beneficiary of the Reagan-Bush years. In the 60s and 70s, an important environmental movement had grown in the nation, horrified at the poisoning of the air, the seas, the rivers, and the deaths of thousands a year as a result of work conditions. Environmental regulation became more and more a victim of cost-benefit analysis, in which regulations protecting the health and safety of the public became secondary to how costly this would be for businesses. Under Reagan and Bush, this concern for the economy, which was a shorthand term for corporate profit, dominated any concern for workers or consumers. President Reagan proposed to replace tough enforcement of environmental laws by a voluntary approach, leaving it to businesses to decide for themselves what they would do. George Bush presented himself as the environmental president and pointed with pride to his signing of the Clean Air Act of 1990. But 2 years after that law was passed, it was seriously weakened by a new rule of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that allowed manufacturers to increase by 245 tons a year hazardous pollutants in the atmosphere. Shortly after Bush took office, a government scientist prepared testimony for a congressional committee on the dangerous effects of industrial uses of coal and other fossil fuels in contributing to global warming, a depletion of the Earth's protective ozone layer. The White House changed the testimony over the scientists' objections to minimize the danger. Again, business worries about regulation seemed to override the safety of the public. The ecological crisis in the world had become so obviously serious that Pope John Paul II felt the need to rebuke the wealthy classes of the industrialized nations for creating that crisis. Can you imagine for the Pope to talk badly? The Pope came out to say today, the dramatic threat of ecological breakdown is teaching us the extent to which greed and selfishness, both individual and collective, are contrary to the order of creation. The human consequences of Reagan's budget cuts went deep. For instance, Social Security disability benefits were terminated for 350,000 people. A man injured in an oil field accident was forced to go back to work, the federal government overruling both the company doctor and a state supervisor who testified that he was too disabled to work. The man died, and federal officials said, "We have a PR problem." A war hero of Vietnam, Roy Benavidez, who had been presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor by Reagan, was told by Social Security officials that the shrapnel pieces in his heart, arms, and leg did not prevent him from working. Appearing before a congressional committee, he denounced Reagan. New requirements eliminated free school lunches for more than 1 million poor children who depended on the meal for as much as half of their daily nutrition. Millions of children entered the ranks of the officially declared poor, and soon a quarter of the nation's children, 12 million, were living in poverty. Welfare became an object of attack. Aid to single mothers with children through the AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, food stamps, healthcare for the poor through Medicaid. For most people on welfare, this meant $500 to $700 a month in aid, leaving them well below the poverty level of about $900 a month. Black children were 4 times as likely as white children to grow up on welfare. Democrats often joined Republicans in denouncing welfare programs. Presumably, this was done to gain political support from a middle-class public that believed they were paying taxes to support teenage mothers and people they thought too lazy to work. Much of the public did not know and were not informed by either political leaders or the media that welfare took a tiny part of the taxes and military spending took a huge chunk of it. Yet, the public's attitude on welfare was different from that of the two major parties. It seemed that the constant attacks on welfare by politicians reported endlessly in the press and on television did not succeed in eradicating a fundamental generosity felt by most Americans. A New York Times CBS News poll conducted in early 1992 showed that public opinion on welfare changed depending on how the question was worded. If the word welfare was used, 44% of those questions said too much was being spent on welfare, while 50% said that either the right amount was being spent or that too little was being spent. But when the question was about assistance to the poor, only 13% thought too much was being spent and 64% thought too little was being spent. This suggested that both parties were trying to manufacture an anti-human needs mood by constant derogatory use of the word welfare, and then to claim that they were acting in response to public opinion. It was the truly wealthy, more than anyone else, who flourished under Reagan. The 1980s were the triumph of upper America, the political ascendancy of the rich, and the glorification of capitalism, free markets, and finance, said Kevin Phillips, a Republican analyst of national politics. When government policy enriched the already rich, it was not called welfare. This was not as obvious as the monthly checks to the poor. It most often took the form of generous changes in the tax system. Not only did the income tax become less progressive during the last decades of the century, but the Social Security tax became more regressive. That is, more and more was deducted from the salary checks of the poor and middle classes, but when the salaries reached $42,000, no more was deducted. But by the early 1990s, a middle-income family earning $37,800 a year paid 7.65% in its income in Social Security taxes. A family earning 10 times as much, $378,000, paid 1.46%. In a two-party system, if both parties ignore public opinion, there is no place voters can turn. And in the matter of taxation, it has become clear that American citizens have wanted taxes that are truly progressive. By the end of the Reagan years, the gap between rich and poor in the United States had grown dramatically, where in 1980 the chief executive officers, CEOs of corporations made 40 times as much in salary as the average factory worker. By 1989, they were making 93 times as much. In the dozen years from 1977 to 1989, the before-tax income of the richest 1% rose 77%. Meanwhile, for the poorest 2/5 of the population, there was no gain at all. And because of favorable changes for the rich in the tax structure, the richest 1% of the decade ending in 1990 saw their after-tax income increase by 87%. In the same period, the after-tax income of the lower 4/5 of the population either went down 5% or went up no more than 8.6%. While everybody at the lower levels was doing worse, there were especially heavy losses for Blacks, Hispanics, women, and the young. The general impoverishment of the lowest income groups that took place in the Reagan-Bush years hit Black families hardest. with their lack of resources to start with, and with racial discrimination facing them in jobs. The victories of the civil rights movement had opened up spaces for some African Americans but left others far behind. They ignored the fact that women taking care of children on their own were working very hard indeed. They did not ask why babies who were not old enough to show their work skills should be penalized to the point of death for growing up in a poor family. Ironically, it was Republican Kevin Phillips who, analyzing the Reagan years, wrote, "Less and less wealth was going to people who produced something. Disproportionate rewards to society's economic, legal, and cultural manipulators, from lawyers to financial advisors." That is the end of part 1 of chapter 21. This shit's sad. This shit is incensing. It's infuriating. It's disrespectful. It is an insult to the intelligence of the American people. And it is continuing. It is pervasive. It is part of the fabric of America. It is a disease in America. It is the bloodline, the legacy of everybody that we're reading about right now, regardless of whether they are alive or dead. I don't know what to say. This is, expected, I guess, at this point. Let me know what y'all think. I'm going to get to reading the rest of this chapter, and I will check in with you as soon as possible. Thank you for being here. Thank you for learning with me. Thank you for leaning in. And, the more things change, the more they stay the same. All right, y'all. We are going to get into part 2 of chapter 21 of A People's History of the United States. So, in 1984, the CIA admitted that it had exaggerated Soviet military expenditures, that since 1975, it had claimed Soviet military spending was growing by 4 to 5% each year, when the actual figure was 2%. Thus, by misinformation, even deception, the result was to inflate military expenditures. When the Soviet Union began to disintegrate in 1989, and there was no longer the familiar Soviet threat, the military budget was reduced somewhat, but still remained huge, with support from both Democrats and Republicans. In 1992, the head of the House Armed Services Committee, Les Aspin, a Democrat, proposed in view of the new international situation that the military budget be cut by 2%, from $281 billion to $275 billion. The same year, as Democrats and Republicans both supported minor cuts in the military budget, a public opinion survey done for the National Press Club showed that 59% of American voters wanted a 50% cut in defense spending over the next 5 years. It seemed that both parties had failed in persuading the citizenry that the military budget should continue at its high level, but they continued to ignore the public that they were supposed to represent. This is still relevant to right now. Reagan came into office just after a revolution had taken place in Nicaragua, in which a popular Sandinista movement named after the 1920s revolutionary hero Agosto Sandino overthrew the corrupt Somoza dynasty, long supported by the United States. The Sandistas, a coalition of Marxists, left-wing priests, and assorted nationalists, set about to give more land to the peasants and to spread education and health care among the poor. The Reagan administration, seeing this as a communist threat, but even more important, a challenge to the long U.S. control over governments in Central America, began immediately to work to overthrow the Sandinista government. It waged a secret war by having the CIA organize a counter-revolutionary force, the Contras, many of whose leaders were former leaders of the hated National Guard under Somoza. The Contras seemed to have no popular support inside of Nicaragua, and so were based next door in Honduras, a very poor country dominated by the United States. From Honduras, they moved across the border, raiding farms and villages, killing men, women, and children. Later that year, Congress, responding perhaps to public opinion and the memory of Vietnam, made it illegal for the United States to support directly or indirectly military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua. The Reagan administration decided to ignore this law and to find ways to fund the Contras secretly, looking for third-party support. Reagan himself solicited funds from Saudi Arabia, at least $32 million. The friendly dictatorship in Guatemala was used to get arms surreptitiously to the Contras. Israel, dependent on U.S. aid and always dependable for support, was also used. In 1986, a story appearing in a Beirut magazine created a sensation that weapons had been sold by the United States to Iran, supposedly an enemy, and that in return, Iran had promised to release hostages being held by extremist Muslims in Lebanon, and that profits from that sale were being given to the Contras to buy arms. When asked about this at a press conference in November 1986, President Reagan told 4 Lies that the shipment to Iran consisted of a few token anti-tank missiles, that the United States did not condone shipments by third parties, that weapons had not been traded for hostages, and that the purpose of the operation was to promote a dialogue with Iranian moderates. In reality, the purpose was a double one: to free hostages and get credit for that, and to help the Contras. The previous month, when a transport plane that had carried arms to the Contras was downed by Nicaraguan gunfire and the American pilot captured, the lies have multiplied. Evidence mounted that the captured pilot was working for the CIA. The whole Iran-Contra affair became a perfect example of the double line of defense of the American establishment. The first defense is to deny the truth. If exposed, the second defense is to investigate, but not too much. The press will publicize, but they will not get to the heart of the matter. Once the scandal was out in the open, neither the congressional investigating committees, nor the press, nor the trial of Colonel Oliver North, who oversaw the Contra aid operation, got to the critical questions. What is U.S. foreign policy all about? How are the president and his staff permitted to support a terrorist group in Central America to overthrow a government that, whatever its faults, is welcomed by its own people as a great improvement over the terrible governments the U.S. has supported there for years? What does the scandal tell about democracy, about freedom of expression, about an open society? Out of the much publicized Contra Gate scandal came no powerful critique of secrecy in government or of the erosion of democracy by actions taken in secret by a small group of men safe from the scrutiny of public opinion. The media, in a country priding itself on its level of education and information, kept the public informed only on the most superficial level. Okay, this is the last video for chapter 21. A Reuters dispatch from Iraq described the destruction of a 73-room hotel in a town south of Baghdad and quoted an Egyptian witness. They hit the hotel full of families, and then they came back to hit it again. Reuters reported that the air raids of Iraq first used laser-guided bombs, but within a few weeks turned to B-52s, which carried conventional bombs, meaning more indiscriminate bombing. The human consequences of the war became shockingly clear after its end, when it was revealed that the bombings of Iraq had caused starvation, disease, and the deaths of tens of thousands of children. A UN team visiting Iraq immediately after the war reported that the recent conflict has wrought nearly apocalyptic results upon infrastructure. Most means of modern life support have been destroyed or rendered tenuous. A Harvard medical team reporting in May said that the child mortality had risen steeply and that 55,000 more children died in the first 4 months of that year than in a comparable period the year before. The director of a pediatric hospital in Baghdad told a New York Times reporter that on the first night of the bombing campaign, the electricity was knocked out. Mothers grabbed their children out of incubators, took intravenous tubes out of their arms. Others were removed from oxygen tanks, and they ran to the basement where there was no heat. I lost more than 40 prematures in the first 12 hours of the bombing. Although in the course of the war, Saddam Hussein had been depicted by U.S. officials and the press as another Hitler, the war ended short of a march into Baghdad, leaving Hussein in power. It seemed that the United States wanted to weaken him, but not eliminate him, in order to keep him as a balance against Iran. In the years before the Gulf War, the United States had sold arms to both Iran and Iraq, at different times favoring one or the other as part of the traditional balance of power strategy. Therefore, as the war ended, the United States did not support Iraqi dissidents who wanted to overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein. A New York Times dispatch from Washington, datelined March 26, 1991, reported President Bush has decided to let Saddam Hussein put down rebellions in his country without American intervention rather than risk the splintering of Iraq, according to official statements of private briefings today. If you go back to the previous chapter, we talked about Brzezinski, who was in there in the White House, basically advising on political strategy. And he was concerned about some negative consequences about the Gulf War. One of them was that the very intensity of the air assault on Iraq gives rise to concern that the new conduct of the war may come to be seen as evidence that Americans view Arab lives as worthless, and that raises the moral question of the proportionality of response. His point about Arab lives being seen as worthless was underlined by the fact that the war provoked an ugly wave of anti-Arab racism in the United States, with Arab Americans insulted or beaten or threatened with death. There were bumper stickers that said, "I don't break for Iraqis." Brzezinski's measured assessment of the Gulf War could be taken as close to representing the new view of the Democratic Party. It went along with the Bush administration. It was pleased with the results. It had some misgivings about civilian casualties, but it did not constitute an opposition. President George Bush was satisfied. As the war ended, he declared on a radio broadcast, "The specter of Vietnam has been buried forever in the desert sands of the Arabian Peninsula." The establishment press very much agreed. A black poet in Berkeley, California, June Jordan, had a different view. "I suggest to you, it's a hit, the same way that crack is, and it doesn't last long." That's the end of chapter 21. I am feeling really overwhelmed this morning. I definitely need to go meditate, and I probably should have meditated before I read this. But I just watched a video about Bisan talking about how she feels right now, and that had me in tears. I'm reading this and drawing parallels to what the Iraqis felt, to what the Palestinians are feeling, and the role of America in all of this, and trying to reckon with the fact that although I hold an American passport, I do not in any way align myself with any of this. And I know so many of you feel that way too. And I'm just kind of like, I'm at a loss for words, man. I'm at a loss for words. These people they're demented. They're demented. I think that's what it is. I'm gonna go ahead and start reading chapter 22, which is titled The Unreported Resistance. As always, thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to lean in and learn. And more than ever, let's just continue to take care of ourselves and preserve ourselves, because we have a long fight ahead. And we're up against some really evil energy and evil forces that want us to give up on imagining a more loving and kinder world, and I refuse to do that. And I hope that you also refuse to do the same. Yeah, I'm gonna try to just power through today and keep reading, and yeah, I'll check in with y'all soon.